Excellent. So today with us, we have Kathleen Wilson, a graduate of the 2017 full-time program at Booth, the co-founder of the Minte, which provides hotel-style housekeeping systems to residents of luxury apartment buildings, and is now building Sofie, a company that shortens the path from inspiration to purchase for beauty e-commerce. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kathleen.
Thank you so much for having me. So I figure I will start with a little bit of broader context on how I ended up digging into NoCode this time around. When I went to Booth, which was 2015 to 2017, my intention was not to go straight into entrepreneurship. I had my consulting offer all lined up, and I'd summered in consulting, but my second to last semester was in commercializing innovation, and we were analyzing a retirement home. One of the aspects was that somebody would come and clean every day, and started thinking, I'm like, this happens in hotels, this happens in senior living. This should happen in my apartment building. If somebody could just push their cart down the hall and hit all the units and spend like 30 minutes, that would be amazing. And so a classmate and I ran around and cleaned our friends' places and said, what would you pay for this? And the Mint was born. It got a lot of traction right off the bat. We spent about 25K building our app for the New Venture Challenge, which we ended up not using in real life at all. And one of the big things for me not knowing that I was going into tech was, as I was starting the Mint, really having to learn it on the fly. We actually had an external contractor our first year, which for all of you founders out there, I highly recommend against it. They a lot of times wanted to build cool new things versus what was best for the business. And so over the course of my time at the Mint, I got more and more into product and understanding how key that was going to be to the company. So with Sofie, which I started in March of 2020, went the NoCode route, really just to build the MVP and get that proof of concept out there, and found that it was much more powerful than I expected. We're at a point now where, your recording stopped, just heads up. So with Sofie, we're at a point now where we've used what's been built on Bubble to get through our seed round. That's coming close to a close, and we now are switching off of NoCode, but it's still, what we've done is quite robust, and I'll talk to you guys a bit about where we did start to see those limitations, and when you might want to start thinking of transferring off of it. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the agenda for today, we'll go over a high level of what's involved in building a product, UI, UX, a front end versus back end, and then we really will get into some of the specifics of Bubble and actually using the tool to get your product up and off the ground. So UX, this is something we experience in everyday life. When it's bad, you'll know it. Most of the things that we experience work, and that is because they are designed well. So ketchup is a great example where for years we had these pretty glass bottles. So they had a great UI, which is the visual component, but the UX, the underlying design, the functionality, not so much. And so they've now switched to these squeezy bottles, which of course makes all of our lives a lot easier. And you want a lot of the same things in your UX UI of your site. It really should be, as soon as people see the page, they know what they're supposed to do, they know what it's asking them, and then whatever action they interact with, it should take them to where they expect to go. So those are the two big things. Like, people, even if they have to click a lot of buttons, which is not ideal, but if people have to click a couple of extra buttons, as long as it's mindless and they can do it without really having to think and figure out what's going on, it's just natural, super important, because that way they'll just keep clicking through. So to go back a little bit, UX is your user experience piece. This is where you typically are drawing out wireframes. So you haven't added colors, you haven't added shapes or anything like that, no style. You're just drawing out the wireframe of, this is what somebody clicks to get from point A to point B. Some of the tools for that. So there's Envision, and then there's Overflow. And these allow you to actually map out the page, click through. You can click through just like it were a real application. You can send it to testers, you can get their feedback. They're very collaborative. So I highly recommend that. I also would recommend hiring someone for the UX UI. It's just, there's so much nuance to it. One of my favorite quotes is, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. And UX UI is very similar. You have to get a lot of information into very few words, and especially for mobile, small screen space. So if there's limited budget, I would recommend trying to make that a priority. The UI component, this is your design and your style. So this is really going to be what overlays the UX, and the two can definitely go hand in hand. So if there's a button that you want to call attention to, you can do that with color. And that of course plays back to the UX, which is the user experience. Some of the best UI tools, Adobe XD is what we ended up going with. It had a lot of things that you could plug into. It really wasn't limited in terms of its capabilities. Personally, I like the fact that it's something you download to the desktop versus Figma and Sketch, which I believe both are only, but all of them work. You know, people use, I've seen Figma probably just as much as XD, and Sketch a little bit less. And then the next thing that you will want to figure out is you're looking into your UX and your UI is, what are you building? Because if you're doing a native app or a web app, you're going to see some major differences there. So if you are building a web app, you have to figure out, am I building this for desktop? Am I building this as a progressive web app? Is it going to be responsive? Am I building it mobile first? And then of course, native app is going to be something that you download in the App Store. So thinking through those two pieces really will guide the way that you're going to build the UX and UI, just in terms of the screen space you have, where you think most of your users will be. So then you have your front end, which is just what it sounds like. Front end is the piece that people actually see. It's what they click, it's what they're interacting with. And Bubble is unique in that it really is front end and back end. Traditionally in development, these two things are split apart, but Bubble being the no-code tool that it is, that's a lot of why, you know, you build out your front end, but then you go into the workflows to tell it what to do on the back end. And then the back end, also pretty simple. This is your data and your calculations. So all of your heavy data is living on the back end. It's just connecting to the front end to pull in what it needs to pull in. Your calculations, anything that takes a lot of processing power, you want that all to happen on the back end, because otherwise it's going to slow down your application. And it's not required, of course, for Bubble. You don't need to know any code to do the back end, but these are some of the typical languages. And then some of the common storage options. So our backend is in AWS, Amazon Web Services. Bubble does have its own database. It's just only so robust. And for what we were doing, because we're bringing in 600,000 SKUs of products, we needed to do something offsite. And actually, to that point, so Bubble, the rule of thumb seems to be around 100,000 rows is when you would want to get off of Bubble's database and into an external server. So up to that point, you know, Bubble can handle it. It's not going to slow you down too much. But after that, you might start running into issues in terms of not only lag when people are using it, but even just getting the data in there can take an extraordinarily long amount of time. And as far as connecting the backend to Bubble, that's actually pretty simple. This was done via API, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. So I will pause there for a moment before we get into the specifics of Bubble. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I had a question in the chat from Josh Sasky. How did you navigate the seed/VC fundraise without having development experience? How did you give them confidence that you can execute or oversee the actual creation?
Yes. So for the Mint, it was, we had the external contractors on board. And so our investors didn't love that. By the time we closed the round, though, we were already fairly far down the path with them. I'd done 2 accelerators, NVC, and then Elm Spring by the time we closed the funding. And so it sort of was what it was. And then because, you know, after that contract ended with those developers, I oversaw all of the tech at the Mint. So we brought in a really experienced CTO, John Ogolo, who I'm still really close with. And it was, while I oversaw it, I still basically learned from him how to build product. I just made sure that it was meeting the business needs, that he was on track with all of the goals that we set up, so on and so forth. So I spent about 1.5 years building product at the Mint, and that's what's allowed me to step in and do it here. And then the team that I have brought on, so I would say 2 things. One, just being able to see it in bubble is like, it sort of negates the question. So we're like, all right, well, there it is, it works. And then the team that I brought on is also really experienced. So my UX designer has 15 years, my front end dev has 20 years, and then my back end has 10 years. And I found them through, I found Tatiana, my UX designer, and Alejandro, my back end dev, but through TopTal. And then I found Sanyan through gun.io. So for a little bit more context, as we were building on Bubble, we needed the UX designer and we needed the backend developer. And then I was building the front end in Bubble in conjunction with, eventually I did bring in a Bubble developer. And then recently, about less than a month ago, we brought on Sanyan to do the front end as we're now getting off of Bubble. So hopefully that gives some context.
Thank you, that was great.
So Bubble itself. Okay, so there's a couple of decisions that you will want to make right off the bat, which have to do with web app versus native app. And that's if you're going to build as a single page application or if you're going to build as a multi-page application. So a single page application is pretty much just what it says. So let me share my whole screen. Give me just 1 second. And I'll pull up the one and show you guys. So this might be a little bit small, so we'll just go back and forth here. The way that I originally built this in Bubble, and this is just a small example here, was I did it as a single web application or a single page application, excuse me. The reason I did that was because I wanted the optionality to potentially wrap it, which is basically a quick process you put it through to be able to put it onto the App Store. So it can actually function as a native app in addition to a web app. However, ended up stepping away from that route for a couple of reasons. So each time you build something in Bubble, you have a page just like this. And then you have various components that you pull onto the page. However, you can also go over here and add a new page. Or what you could do is you could say, all right, once somebody clicks this button, I want this to disappear and I want something else to show up. And so if it is a single web page application, it's all the same URL. Like if you were browsing something on the web, the top line typically wouldn't change. It's just that things would be hidden and shown within the interface because it's all one page. So the reason to do that in Bubble is so that you can wrap it as a native app. It also tends to be a little bit faster once somebody has loaded it. So because they're loading so much at the beginning, you have a little bit longer delay when that page is first loading. But because everything's loaded, it tends to be faster once it's already up and running. Now, the other issue there, though, is that you can run into when somebody hits the back button, it is going to take them completely off of your page. So for us, the original name of the company was The Edit, so somebody would be at the edit.io. And then because it literally is a single page, if you hit the back button in your browser instead of within the app, which especially in mobile, most people tend to do, it's going to take them back to the last page that they were at entirely and off of your page. So we found it to be just much, much easier to build on the multi-page application, but for some smaller applications, and especially if you want it to be a native app, single page may make sense. There's another alternative there that we'll get into a little bit later as well. And then building a page, which went over a little bit, then we'll talk about responsiveness, workflows, plugins, APIs, and this sort of stuff. Okay, so we really just covered all of this, but here are the bullet points for it. So the single web page, if you do want to wrap it, you can go to gonative.io. One other quick note here, it's really not good for SEO because SEO is looking at the URL and what's in the URL. And so on a single web page, that often is not changing. And so it's not great for that process. The multi-web page, this is what most of us typically are used to. You don't need to hide and show the various components. I mean, you might here and there, but that's not typically how it works. You're going to go to a whole new page and you're going to see, you know, your screen would sort of like white out for a second while the new page reloads. All right, and then web app versus native app. A lot of things these days really are going to PWA, which is progressive web app. Native apps obviously are still a thing, but I'm seeing fewer and fewer startups choose to go that route first, just because it is more limited and you need to do it for iOS and for Android, and getting people over that first hump of actually downloading something versus, you know, just clicking on their browser and typing it in, which is much faster. So app, just so everybody's aware, means both of these things. Once you get into, you know, a little bit of the development world, it just means application. It doesn't mean like an iOS app that I'm downloading. So the web app is, this would be like your desktop website, or again, just any site that you would go to through your browser. So if you go to the Facebook native app, you're opening up the app. If you open up Chrome and you go to facebook.com, that's a PWA. You do need to factor in responsiveness because your web app is going to be seen on multiple sized screens. That's something that Bubble does have. So we'll dig into that in a couple of pages. The native app. Okay, so here's your alternative option. If you don't want to build a single page web app in Bubble and wrap it, what you can do is use Bubble's backend, so meaning using their database, their API connector, etc., and connect it to an actual app front end that you build on an alternate platform. One great option there is DraftBit. Thunkable's another one. Nah. But if you go on DraftBit, you literally can drag and drop things similar to Bubble, but you're actually building a native app. And then if you need to connect to databases, you can use Bubble to connect to the backend database. Any questions there?
Yes, I have one here from Breck Furnace asking, is there a benefit to using Bubble on the back end versus Webflow?
I am not familiar enough with Webflow as a backend. I've always considered them more of a let's make things pretty front end. So I don't have a great answer for you there. Sorry.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Please pop them in the chat.
All right, so building a page. This part is pretty self-explanatory. There's a whole lot of components over here on the left. Just go ahead and get back into Bubble. And I'm going to go to our actual.
I was going to say, we do have a couple more questions if you want to take them now, or we can. Yeah. Okay. From Josh Stask, what are the deciding factors about these entrepreneurial ventures that made you pick pursuing those as opposed to taking the cushy consulting gig?
So for the Mint, it was just a no-brainer. Like everybody that I told the idea to, they were like, "Oh, I get it. That should be a thing." We got so much traction right off the bat. You know, our first building, we had 40% sign up, and so I had a 6-month window to let them know. Even before our round was closed, like things were just going so well that, I mean, I'd known for months that I wasn't going to go back to the consulting route, because to me, the risk was never that much different. You know, like if there's a company that I have control over, I'm taking away some of the risk of, you know, let's say macro trends, where if a consulting firm needs to let people go or whatever it might be, there's less that you can have your hands on. And so in that sense, I was totally okay with the risk. You know, we also ended up closing a 2.4 million round that January. So I knew we had at least a year, you know, year and a half of runway, all of which would made me, you know, definitely comfortable enough to do it. And then the Mint grew very quickly. I mean, we were at a 3 million plus run rate over the course of 2 years. And now, you know, with COVID, they've pulled back, but they are still around. So we shall see. And after the Mint, it wasn't even a question. Like, I loved doing this. It was a good fit. The investors were great. And so it was just, all right, what do I want to build next?
That's great. Thank you. That's really great perspective. And a couple kind of related questions. And then I think we'll go on with the presentation, maybe take more a little later. But from Renson M, does Bubble manage the entire deployment process in web server? And from Breck Furnace, is Bubble the best option to your knowledge for managing the backend?
Backend question is a very good question, and I don't have a good answer for you because we've managed our backend largely in AWS. So I think you just have to dig in and see what you need to do and what Bubble can do. We really have managed ours offsite and connected via APIs. And then as far as deployment, yeah, that takes 2 seconds. We just go in and we had to do a few settings on the Google side, but then you click deploy and like, yeah.
Great, thank you.
All right. So as far as the components, it's a little small, but let me go ahead and make this bigger. So you've got all of your typical stuff that you would expect over here. I do not know what find is, but I'm quite curious. Our Bubble developer must have added that in there. So you can put in text, you can put in buttons, you can put in an image, you can put in a shape, anything. I mean, that's almost like PowerPoint, right? Like whatever you need to draw in there, you just do. There's just more options and things are a bit more. So, we overlaid this image, we overlaid this button. So there's certain things that you won't see until you actually take it off of preview. So for example, until you do preview it. So we have CSS in some of these, which allows us to do this style that I was dead set on, which is called neumorphic, which is one of those things that is, if you're building an MVP, you probably don't need it to be this special and pretty, but for a consumer brand, design is important. So there's CSS embedded in here that when you preview it, you can see. So there really is a lot of capability, a lot of flexibility that Bubble gives you. And then as we scroll down further, we just have more, building the page components that are added in. And so I think that's all fairly self-explanatory. Once you do add in a component, you have this window of all sorts of things that you can do with it. So, okay, here's our hero image. This is where it's pulling from. This one's pretty simple. There's no shadow. This is our minimum width. This has to do with responsiveness. So, if somebody's working on a very big screen or very small screen, you can make sure that a certain picture isn't going to become 10% of what it should be by setting some of these minimum and widths here. If I had something that I didn't want to be visible right when the page loaded, maybe you have to click something and then it shows up. That's what this handy little checkbox does. And then you can set, of course, the height and so on. And then text gives you another set of options. So the styles are quite nice, actually. You can do, we have all of our set files built in here. So if we want to change something, you can change it across the board by going back here and just saying, oh, hey, button secondary is actually going to look a little bit different now. And then, of course, that makes it easy to format any button you're working on. So to get out of here. And all right, so that's our style. We talked about being visible on pod page load. And then if you wanted to do some bolding and all of that stuff, you can go into the rich text editor. So everything is here right at your fingertips, unless you start getting into really special stuff. But typically, whatever the element is, you click on it, you go to the editor, and then you have all of those options right there. And they're pretty self-explanatory. So with that said, I believe our next item is responsiveness. So, okay, if you're building a progressive web app, this is super important. Let me show you guys our there's a lot on here, but oh, this is not the right one. So I'm going to show you all how we did manage the responsiveness. We actually ended up having 2 different pages for mobile and for desktop for a few of the items, just because making it responsive on some of these pages looked like we didn't have a different design. And you can tell Bubble like, hey, if this is on mobile or if this screen size is below this certain, width and height, use this option. And if it's not, use that option. It's pretty straightforward. You can see how much is here based on the fact that it's taking this long to load. I'll give another 2 seconds, and then if it doesn't, okay, welcome to it. Okay. All right, so on our product page, all right, so this is Adobe XD. We've got all of our flows here, and our product page on mobile. Find it, spend a minute. Is a much smaller version. Here we go. Right, so this is the product page on mobile, and then this is the product page on desktop. So if we tried to make this something that worked on desktop, it ended up looking funny, like these things didn't go wide enough, quite right, and this is falling below the page. And so Bubble knows that, okay, if somebody's on a desktop or a screen of a certain size, go ahead and move to this design instead. That's not always necessary. It just happened to be with this one that we couldn't get the responsive quite right. But I will show you what the responsive feature looks like. So you go right here, and then you literally can just pull this in and out. So if we made it that small, that's what it would look like. We made it super huge, that's what it would look like. And so you can get a sense of what this is going to be on different screen sizes. And then you can start to set those minimum and maximum widths. So for example, like this one, I would actually have it right now, I believe it's set to not shrink. I don't know why we did that, but I did. Whereas if you set it to shrink with everything else, then of course it would also get smaller. And so the responsive really is, I mean, it's pretty tricky. You have to play with it. You have to figure out, all right, what minimum, maximum heights and widths are going to work, etc. But Bubble does, at least a decent job of moving things around for you based off of the screen size. Any questions there before we move on?
Yeah, I've got a comment from my colleague Christopher Schneider, who does our IT support. It has been really amazing in terms of different technical tools and tools for facilitating innovation, basically. So definitely talk to him if you have questions. He says the backend capabilities of Bubble is really useful if you don't have the knowledge or ability to engineer it. It may be the best option for starting out, but probably will not scale forever.
Yeah.
And we did have a question from Edwin. How does building your e-commerce product this way compare to building your e-commerce site using Shopify?
So for us, it's an entirely different thing. We are not going on Shopify to sell our own products. What we are doing is it's like visuals when we can get them, but okay, so for us, there's 3 major components to Sofie. One is the database. So this pretty much is every SKU that exists in the makeup and skincare world. We've scraped and pulled from various sites and made them all into a nice, neat database of all the products that are mentioned. And then also has duplicates, right? So we can tell you that, okay, if you're buying Maybelline, or more often, if you're buying Dior and you're tired of dropping 45 bucks on foundation, we can tell you a $20 product that's going to have similar ingredients, similar formulation, the same skin tone, etc. So that's our database of duplicates. Secondarily, we have a shade matching algorithm. So the user tells us the shade that they currently wear, maybe their Estee Lauder Liquid Foundation 1N, and then based off of that, we can now tell them what foundation shade they should purchase in any other product. And then the third aspect is universal checkout. So while you're on Sofie, you don't need to leave Sofie to buy one thing from Sephora and one thing from Target and one thing from Ulta. That all will happen in a singular cart. And you can see where each thing's coming from, that it's actually getting sent via virtual credit card off to the various retailers. And so because we're building something more robust and more custom, Shopify was an option.
Great, and we had a question from Breck who said, thanks, Chris. Know anything about the connection of Webflow to AWS? Christopher, I have made you a co-host, but if you want to follow up perhaps by email, Kathleen, if you have something to say to that as well, I do want to make sure.
What his answer is too.
All right, yeah, Christopher, if you want to unmute, you can, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can as well. Not hearing anything at the moment. So maybe if you want to, Christopher, you want to put your response in the chat and we can read it later.
That probably gets us close to where. So workflows are starting to touch on the back end of Bubble. So let's get into those. So workflows are specific to the page, and then they also can be organized by folder and by color. So this page, I don't think it's not going to have a ton. We just go on the workflow tab. And so, all right, when submit is clicked, we're going to hide the did you buy, then we're going to animate the thank you card. Let's see. When the page is loaded, we want to make sure that some of our page my own. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, so there's different, I think these are a good example. Flow 1, flow 2, flow 3. Sofie is organized by jobs to be done. Job to be done 1 is I want to find a shade. Job to be done 2 is I want to find a duplicate. And job to be done 3 is find a product for a certain occasion. So when flow 1 is clicked, we're actually now going to move them to page 2. And then page 3, and then you can see like only when, and then you can be as specific as you need to within here. Let me go to another page that has some color coding. All right, so if you want to organize by color, you can. If you want to pause something, you also can. And go into it's not a good example, but I think you guys get the idea. I mean, you pretty much say when something is clicked, do this. When somebody selects X, do Y, and you know, I'll just add a new action, or I'll add an event so you can see some of the options. Right, so you could say when users logged in, do this. When users logged out, do that. When the page is loaded, do something. If this condition is true or not true. The conditionals are really powerful in Bubble. It's more than we have time to go into today, but I'll point you to some resources that are helpful there. And then elements, so if something's clicked, if something's value is, you know, over X or under X. And then custom events pretty much let you tell it to do anything based on anything. Okay, so the data, just since there have been questions on the back end. So the database is pretty straightforward. You have a data type, and then within that data type, you have various fields. So some of this, frankly, we're not even using. It's done offsite via our API. But these are some of the things that we built along the way. So if I want product details, like, okay, coverage, which we have more about, but if we're comparing, we want the brand ID, the brand name, the category of product, the product ID, which is our unique identifier, the product name. And so you can start to build this stuff out in Bubble. You can build a whole bunch of different views if you want to. Right now I'm in the dev data instead of the live data, but you can just switch back and forth as you need to. And so for us, we have actually, I'll just move us on to plugins, which I think are next anyway. So we have done pretty much everything through the API connector. So what is an API? I'm going to bounce this around a little bit. Bear with me. Okay, APIs are pretty simple. You basically are saying, go here and get the data. The example here is you tell the server that you want pancakes. He acts like the API, he goes and gets the pancakes, and then he brings them back to you. So with an API, you are initiating. So you're the one saying, hey, go and get this, please. There's also something called webhooks, which are reverse API, but more than we'll get into today. So back on the API side. All right, so this is one of our APIs. This is where we're pulling brand names, right? So we're telling there's certain places in Bubble where, you know, let's say we're in a box that's showing a product. We can tell that box, hey, we need you to get information from a certain API because of this connector. And so what it's doing is saying, okay, you're telling me to get information from API, get brand name, and you would do that in the editor box. So then, I don't know, I'm trying to copy this, but I'm not gonna do a thing. No, okay. Okay, so then once it goes to this URL, it has this big list of all of the data. And so back in Bubble, saying, okay, here's all the things that you could grab from this API, brand ID, name, product ID, category, so on and so forth. And so then you would just tell that particular item or component in Bubble, you'll find a good page. That is what you want to pull. So here. All right, so in some of these fields is where you would start to put the API information. So initial content, no, not mess anything up because I actually haven't been in here in a couple months. My Bubble developer has been, but you can say get data from an external API. And so if I were to say get data from an external API, then it would allow me to pick one of the APIs that I had connected. And then once I had chosen that API that I connected, I could say, okay, great, grab this particular thing from that API. So, you know, that's really all it's doing, just to sort of go back over it again. API is a way to go to a certain URL and fetch data from that URL. So, you know, for us, that's all held offsite with Amazon Web Services, but then we just go into Bubble and we say, okay, for this particular thing, we need to get data from an external API. The plugin connector does it for us. So then once we just not anything else we're doing this. Shoot, sorry guys. But once we click get data from an external API, it will give you the options of which of those particular fields that you saw on the plugin you actually want to pull from. So again, plugin, these are all the different fields. And then we also have other APIs, like if you instead say you want to get shade name, then you could pull all of these things about shade name. What questions do we have on that piece?
So right now we have some questions about accelerators that I think might be super interesting to do at the end, and see if we have any questions on, or any more questions on NoCode and Bubble.
And I really just have one more page on NoCode too, and then we can switch over. All right, so resources. Personally, I found coaching NoCode apps to be extremely, extremely helpful. I think anytime that you try to learn development, if you just go down the YouTube rabbit hole, you do a lot of bouncing around and sometimes there's conflicting information. So for me, I mean, it's, you know, semi-expensive, is $700 for the video series, but I spent 2 weeks going through them and I had a really solid framework to then be able to put into context anything else that I wanted to learn. And that covers, I mean, just about everything except for some really, you know, going above and beyond and bubble sort of stuff. They also have a 3-month hands-on thing that's, I want to say, like 3,500, and their founders actually like work with you and you meet every week to build out their app. Bubble has their own boot camps as well. These are all right. I would not have found it that useful if I didn't already have the foundation of from coaching NoCode apps personally. And then hiring a Bubble developer. So I didn't attempt this until I had already been working on Bubble. I would say you could do it after a month or two. For me, it was a little bit longer. I knew exactly what I was looking for and I knew what questions to ask to know if somebody knew what they were doing. So definitely familiarize yourself with the platform first. And then codemap.io is a really good source for that. It's sort of like the Upwork for, you know, people. Upwork might have some options too, but I found Eli on Codemap and he's been awesome. And then just to be on the safe side, like I always make extra copies of my app from time to time, which you probably saw in the Bubble interface. There were like 7 of the same thing. So you can go and delete older ones, but I just like to have an extra version of Bubble lets you do that for free. So I think that is pretty much it. But happy to answer any questions on the Bubble stuff and accelerators.
Great, thank you so much for a great presentation and thank you for taking questions throughout. So yeah, we had a couple of questions. This is from Josh Stasky and Josephine Cujo also says this would be relevant. So what recommendations would you give regarding accelerators? What did you like or don't like? What would you have done differently?
So I love my accelerator. So when I went into, so I did 2 with the Mint. When I went into NBC, I had no clue what I was doing. Like I kept trying to put consulting decks on there with 12 footnotes and Tebby and my co-founder had to like beat it out of me. Like, no, there should be like 5 things on this page and then you're just going to voice it over. So NBC I found very helpful in terms of learning how to pitch. As far as like validating the business idea and stuff, I don't know if there was quite as much of that. You know, I guess that was sort of there automatically, right? And part of like building out your deck. But for me, it was just learning the format and the context of pitching, and this is how you talk to investors, et cetera. And then when I did the Elm Spring Accelerator, I also found that super helpful. So NBC, because we were just in the 30, we weren't in the top 10. There was no equity exchange. And then for Elm Spring, and then we got a little bit of cash. We got 20 grand, but the big thing for me, they were specifically a prop tech accelerator, property technology. And so they got me into my first building. So I had no problem giving up the equity in exchange for being able to have that first proof point of, okay, we're in the building, we have users signed up, we have revenue. And I've even found with Sofie, like once you have revenue, you're in a very different ballgame of being able to prove something out. Okay, people want this, even if it's early stage. So I found Elm Spring super helpful. I would do an accelerator again. I don't know if I'd want to do a virtual accelerator, just personal preference. Like so much of the experience was you have an office to go into every day. And especially because I was the sole founder, you know, there are all the other founders you could hang out with. For somebody who, you know, is later stage, the equity gets more expensive with an accelerator. But for me, especially with the Mint, I looked at it as a 0-1, right? Like this is going to be a thing or it's not going to be a thing. If I give up a little bit more equity to meaningfully progress this along. And
Thank you so much. That was a really great information. Any other questions? If anyone has questions about the Polsky Center as a whole, I potentially can answer those. Just pop your questions in the chat. Well, in that case, I guess I can, Justice, thank you for taking the time. I guess we can wrap up here and give people a few minutes of their day back. So thank you very much for attending our Building a No-Code Product workshop. We have coming up, we have our Distinguished Entrepreneur Speaker Series, got a fireside chat with Airbnb co-founder Nathan Bulkerzik. So I will put that link in the chat. Fun spot let you there. So check that out. We also do have,
Elizabeth, if people wanted a copy of the deck, is that something you just send out en masse?
Yes, we can do that as long as you're okay with that. So yeah, thank you. I was going to ask on that, but we're very happy to do that. There'll be a recording that we'll send out the link to, and we can follow up about who you want to send the recording to, whether it's to everyone who signed up or to everyone who attended. And also we have, we are always trying to iterate and improve what we are providing. So we have a survey link that I'm going to pop in the chat. Please, a very short survey, please fill that out. Let us know what you thought of this workshop. We definitely want to hear from you. So I'll give people a few minutes to grab that. And some thanks, looks like people are into this. So thank you very much, Kathleen, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.